In CSS, you can select the font you want to use for the text inside of a particular element by setting the font-family property in a style rule. But before we get into the details of font family, we'll have to understand how to use font names. Because when we create a web page, we don't always know what our users will use to view that web page. It might be a PC, a smartphone, even a refrigerator. And we cannot be sure that all of the devices that users will have the same set of fonts available, because specific fonts are not defined by web standards, and the web browser is going to rely on the user's system, like Windows or OS X, to provide them with the fonts that we request. What the CSS standards do define is a collection of 5 font categories. The first of these categories is the categories of serif fonts. An example of a specific font that would fit in this category would be Times or Times New Roman, as well as Baskerville, Century, and Schoolbook. Those are specific font names, like Baskerville, Century, and Schoolbook. Those are the font names that you might see in a drop-down list when you're selecting a font inside of a word processor, because the word processor knows exactly what is installed on your machine. But to CSS, all these fonts would fall under the category of serif fonts. There is also a set of sans serif fonts, or sans serif, depending on what part of the world you come from, and a popular font that falls into this category is Arial. In case you didn't know, serifs are the small lines at the end of a letter. They make the letters look a little bit fancy and embellished. You can see the difference in the R letters that are on the screen now. The R on the left is an Arial, which is sans serif, literally without the embellishments, while the R on the right is Times New Roman, and it contains a few extra little strokes here and there. Generally speaking, people find the sans serif fonts easier to read on an LCD display. There are also categories for cursive fonts, which look a bit like handwritten letters, and fantasy fonts, which can look like anything, but most designs are not going to make heavy use of these fonts because they can be hard to read and also a little bit unpredictable. We're not exactly sure how they're going to display on the end user system. Finally, there is a category for monospace fonts. These are the fonts that give equal spacing to every letter, and that's probably the font that you want to use in your text editor that you use to create CSS, and also the font that you would want to use on a web page to display code in a web page. Let's take a look at these fonts in a browser.